Obviously, the movement around the world and the reaction to Gaza has been something which many, and I include myself here, I've been an activist now for decades, since South Africa and the fight against apartheid when I was a student, and the Iraq War, the Bosnian conflict, and moving on to 9/11 and Afghanistan, Iraq, and all of that. But this, almost unprecedented, I would suggest, in terms of the kind of reaction it has created. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether it's because of the barbarity that has unfolded before the eyes of the world, or whether it's because we are now in the midst of a technical revolution whereby, second by second, we get the news, we get the images, we get the sounds, we almost get the smells. And that is leading to a different kind of reaction than when 20 years ago we needed to wait for what's happening to be told on the news and as such. But there is definitely a level of awareness and a level of self-searching within the West particularly that we seldom saw before. Those young students who belong to middle-class, white, privileged families who are now camping, in their university campuses, defying threats of intimidation, threats of being fired, of being dismissed and the such, and still waving the Palestinian flags, still chanting from the river to the sea, standing tall, smiling to the cameras when they're getting arrested. The kind of questions they are asking, the kind of statements they are making, in my estimation, is something that goes beyond anything that we might have imagined.
Sure. So there are many dimensions to this. Of course, you already mentioned the role of the media. So it is not like, one has to wait for days or in the older times, even for weeks, for the news to arrive. So social media has made it even more like instant. So those things are definitely there, but I think at a political level, it also means that the ideology of democracy, and when we speak about democracy as an empirical effective means, it is national democracy. We do have a conversation about so-called global democracy, but it doesn't have an institutional empirical basis. So clearly there is a generational question, there is a media question, there is the sense and sensibility of this new generation. All those factors are at a stake here. But I think at the political level, it is also, especially the younger generation, but also in a significant way, the older generation, they feel somehow exhausted. And in my view, I think this ideology, because, the national democracy, it seems to have exhausted itself. The kind of appeal it used to have in the past, I don't think it is any longer enjoying that attraction. You mentioned about these protests in the US, in many campuses, in Columbia, at City University of New York, at Brown University, where I was visiting professor for a month, and also at City University of New York. So this is remarkable. I would also add, I spent 9 years teaching in Australia. What is remarkable that in a high school, these are very young, mostly female students, somewhere around between 17, maybe 16 to 19, 20 years of age. And the principal of the school already preempted that these students might do something in terms of protest against the genocidal violence against Palestinians. So they had already issued a directive not to resort to any kind of public criticism. And yet, these very young people, so we are talking about teenagers, on their own, there was no mobilization on their own, they staged a walkout. So this is really remarkable. And if you go in further details, as you see, the global media itself is highly controlled. In the case of Australia, much of the mainstream media is controlled by Robert Murdoch and his associates, okay? Whether it is in Sydney or Melbourne. And as you know, in Australia, 90% of the population is mostly in these big cities. So these young students, they were not buying the narrative dished out by these mainstream media, which in any case has lost, if at all it ever had in the past, by the way. It had lost any moral claim. So these young people, they were finding their own windows into what is happening in Gaza, and this was mostly through social media, I think through Instagram, through TikTok. And this was important because, and this was also, one has to also connect it to the new generation of Palestinians themselves on the ground. Unlike in the past, you had many vocal Palestinian activists. So even though they have been under subjugation for decades, but there is a younger generation which is very active. Some of them are very fluent and articulate in English. So they were recording their tales of oppression and suffering and then posting it on social media. So you are right. I think on the one hand, we have something which is very optimistic. In some ways, one might say that, it is like what happened on the US campuses in the time of Vietnam War.
Vietnam, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So huge protest, and it is not simply a students, faculty, activist, journalist, artists. They have come up together, and they are openly voicing.
It's interesting what you said earlier about the young being exhausted with democracy, with the national democratic being, whatever it is, either institution or a system or whatever it is. Generally speaking, when such exhaustion sort of took hold in the UK, for instance, or across Europe amid an economic crisis or whatever, you would find that the response would be in terms of political apathy, would be in terms of people saying, we're sick and tired of everything, we don't care. But these people, they're exemplifying something else. They're actually saying the actual opposite, that we are exhausted, as you put it, but that we care so deeply that we're willing to put our careers, our academic trails, our jobs on the line. So this is a different this is a different kind of exhaustion, but that is leading to activism of a new sort.
So as you see, people have said a time of fundamental crisis, okay? Or if you want to use the word called emergency situation. Emergency situation or a condition of crisis can lead to a sense of defeatism, but it also has the potential to reactivate oneself and to reactivate the society at large. So both the possibilities have existed in history. In the wake of defeat or decline, some people resign themselves to the condition in which they have been placed. But there are others who rekindle that hope in order to imagine a new social order, in order to imagine a new mode of living which is more humane and more based on justice and fairness. So we have both the tendencies in history. What is important here is that this sign of optimism, okay? And in political science, probably one uses this term called domino effect.
Yes.
So once it began at University of Columbia, then gradually you see on the campuses in the UK, in Australia, at University of Sydney, there is an encampment, and within the US, right? Now, I think from the perspective of democracy, what is important is to see that these robust voices, and by the way, it is not something like, unlike mobilization on the side of the oppressors, okay? They have also done their own mobilization. So there is no big financial power involved in this mobilization. If with some qualification we can say that these people are self-mobilized, they are fired by a sense of justice and ethics, right? So the fact that this protest has erupted, it is very laudable. People are, as you said, risking their life and career. Now, from the perspective of democracy, we have to see to what extent these robust ethical voices are suppressed in the ultimate analysis, or they find some space in reorganization of the social arrangement. Okay? So there are two dimensions of this reality: is the optimism, the spread of the protest. But the other side is severe repression. I think it was University of Emory, a philosophy professor is being dragged.
Yes.
And one, I think, from economics, right? And these police officers, they are pouncing on her as if she's a criminal. I mean, she's an academic. One of them is a philosopher who has, done work about psychoanalysis and so on. Now, as you know from the history of America, the same police officer, these are non-armed academics, intellectuals. You pounce upon them as if they are criminals and you have defeated or captured the enemy. But actually, when black people are attacked, so the same police, rather than preventing the crime against the disadvantaged section, either it keeps silence or it withdraws, or sometimes, as you know, from the case of George Floyd, they participate in that very act of violence. You remember, I still remember when, I think it is George Floyd who said that I cannot breathe. Yes. You see these heavy boots of the police right at the neck of George Floyd, right? So on the one hand, so you see, you cannot, rather than preventing the oppression, the police is participating in that oppression. So my point is, while we must be very optimistic that, okay, finally this large-scale protest has appeared on different campuses, but we have to also see the severe amount of repression which has been undergoing from one end of the country to another, but also globally, okay? Before I moved to Istanbul, I worked in Germany for 5 years at Max Planck Institute. Now, a colleague of mine who is Australian, he was invited to Max Planck Institute. His name is Ghassan Haj, originally of Lebanese extraction. And his offer was from the Max Planck, was withdrawn. And you know what is the ground? Because he had made a social media post, okay, which was mildly critical, okay? If I was working today in Max Planck, I would have been fired, or I would be already fired. You know why? Because I think you might remember the most famous living philosopher of the world is Jürgen Habermas, who is German. And he signed a letter with 4 scholars on Gaza. And this entire, it is shocking because from a philosopher like Jürgen Habermas, for him, everything begins on 7th of October. There's complete...
As though there is nothing before that.
The entire historicity is whitewashed, and Habermas is known as philosopher of universalism. So I wrote an article saying that what kind of universalism is this? And if you are a philosopher, and that is something probably we should talk about, a philosopher are you a philosopher of white European power, or you are a philosopher of humanity, right? So it was very clear that rather than siding with humanity or looking at the suffering of Palestinians, okay, he is seduced by immediacy, meaning that everything began on 7th of October, whitewashing of history. And then he's saying that, well, to call it a genocide is problematic. You know?
What else do you call it then?
Right. So I wrote a critique of Habermas. So if I were in Germany, I would be already fired. Now, this is a very curious case that, Germany is, of course, in its self-perception as well as in the perception of others, it is a democracy. But what kind of democracy it is? You see, some of the protests which took place, I think, in Munich and in Berlin, women were attacked by the police. They were not doing anything.
Correct. They were just there. They were just standing there.
Right. So it is not that you are setting a shop on fire. They are simply walking, chanting, raising slogans. So if you do not allow even this kind of dissent, then what is the meaning of democracy in the first place?
Is it that people are discovering the reality of democracy? Is it that the current system simply lies when certain values are raised, such as democracy, such as human rights, such as women's rights? I mean, someone commented on that incident where the police mishandled, abused the philosophy lecturer, saying that probably those same officers were sent to Afghanistan in order to liberate the women of Afghanistan. They themselves are now, handling this particular lady, an academic, an intellectual, an American, in this particular way. So what exactly do you think, happening within the psyche of this new generation, of this generation that is asking these questions, that is observing these contradictions between what is being said and what is being done? I mean, throughout my activist life, I've always said that there is a degree of double standard, a degree of hypocrisy and the such, but there wasn't anything that I could actually put my finger on. But now it's there. It's laid bare before American eyes, never mind the eyes of Palestinians or the eyes of, Afghanis or Iraqis or the such, but before the eyes of Americans and hence the world. Do you think that will lead to something of, a transformative moment, probably something else? Some new generation that will rethink this whole paradigm of democracy and how it behaves in light of when it feels under attack and its interests under threat?
So you see, two arguments or points which are generally brought in such kind of discussion is the notion of hypocrisy and double standard. When you use the word hypocrisy, it means that a person or a country or the state, it believes in A, but it is doing B.
B, correct.
Right? But then the idea is that if it believes in A, it should also practice in
correct.
A, right?
Correct.
Now, double standard is that, okay, there are two standards. I think the question is probably far beyond the notion of hypocrisy, because I don't think they even believe in it. And I will give you some examples.
So they don't even believe in A.
Right. So the charge of hypocrisy will be meaningful only when you have a set of values,
yes,
and then you say that, no, you're not practicing it.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So this is the first point about hypocrisy. The second point about double standard, I would suggest to you and also the viewers at large that actually there are multiple standards. In fact, one can say that there is no standard. The only standard is the maintenance, and sometimes it is brutal and ruthless, of the Western interest. Or if we move outside of the West, of the national interest. Right? Now, when it comes to democracy, let's talk about what actually democracy is. Because of course, I'm not going into that definitional enterprise. But from a perspective of a critical scholar, you see, the word in Greek is demokratia. Now, kratia means capacity to do things. And demo is people. So people's capacity to do things. Now, historically, this idea of democratia was posited against two powerful notions. One is monarchia and then oligarchia. Now, monarchia is, mono means one. So the rule of one. Oligarchia is rule of a coterie or few. Against this, the idea of democratia was not just statistics or numbers, okay? But you will see that in many parts of the world, particularly in India, democratia is now mobilized or interpreted to mean the rule of the majority. Historically, it is not. It is against monarchia, which is the rule by one, oligarchia by few, and then democratia is, it doesn't specify the number. You have political theorists who have talked about it.
It's assumed that it includes everyone.
Right.
It's assumed.
Right. And as you know, even in a society, so I think there is hardly any society, by which I mean nation state, on this planet, which is culturally monolithic. There is always diversity, whether it is diversity of language, culture. I mean, I did my PhD in Holland. It is a very small country, okay? The entire population of Holland is little more than the total population of New Delhi, where I was based before I moved to. But even there is a small province, and these people, they say that, no, we don't speak Dutch. Their argument is that our language is Fries. So even a tiny country. Now the point is, since demo, people are nowhere monolithic, there would be differences along religious lines, cultural lines, ethnic lines, linguistic lines, right? And therefore, if the original idea of democratia is the capacity to rule, then it logically follows that people in a polity, since that polity is diverse, then these people should be given the capacity to govern differently. And therefore, I mean, as you know, Tocqueville, who wrote about democracy in America, even he mentions about the tyranny of the majority, right? Now here, according to the liberal idea of democracy, there is nothing called a permanent majority and permanent minority, because the idea is that based on issues, majority will cease to exist, in the sense that on a particular issue, for example, on a particular kind of tax, you will have a different set of people who will say that, okay, let's go for it. But on another issue, the same people might go to a reverse position, right? But we are talking about something like a permanent majority, right? Now, if this is the real meaning, or this is from my ethical perspective, I think this is how it ought to be, because in the Middle East, and not simply Middle East, but also outside of the Middle East, to have a polity in a region or in a region which is so culturally diverse, right? If you really go by this meaning of democracy, this has been often flouted, because democracy in the Western sense, as it has been practiced, it first begins with assumption not of a people in general, but of a particular kind of people. And if that people is in power, then they would talk about democracy. And I will give you an example. You know, Wali Reza Nasr. He wrote the book called The Shia Revival. Now, what is this book? In my view, this is an application of Huntington in the Middle Eastern context. After the book was published, he was interviewed. And as you know, after the invasion, I mean, the whole bogus logic which was given about the invasion is first the weapons of mass destruction, which is on the negative side, And the positive side is that we will bring democracy.
Yes. This is in Afghanistan.
No, in Iraq also.
In Iraq as well. Okay.
Right?
Yes.
No, in Iraq.
Yes. Okay.
So, of course, Nasser also marginally talks about Afghanistan,
yeah.
but the focus is the Middle East.
Okay.
Right? So, in the interview, he's asked that, look, this is, his book came in 2006. And what he does, so Huntington's thing is at a global level that we will have clash of civilization, and this civilization, he thinks, predominantly in religious terms. So the core would be religious. Now, Nasr applies the same thing with some modification that no, in the case of Middle East, this will be sect, and therefore the Shia revival. The assumption is that Sunnis have dominated until now, but what happens in the wake of invasion of Iraq, the sect will be the key point of fault line. So he's asked that, look, now the invasion has happened. So the invasion is in 2003. His book is in 2006, right? So he asked that, but what about these elections and so on? So he refers to his conversation with British ambassador. And he says that, well, election will happen, but we need to have certain necessary ground for the election. Now, what is that ground? You are probably from Iraq.
Yes.
Kirkuk?
No, I'm from Tikrit.
Right, but Kirkuk is a place.
But Kirkuk is a place, of course.
Kirkuk,
yes.
Right?
And it's disputed between Arabs and Kurds and
right.
Turkmens.
And it is in the north, right?
Yes.
So he says that, no, we will have election in Kirkuk only when there is certain kind of demographic changes ensured, which means when it becomes Kurdish majority, then we will have election. Before that, there will be ethnic cleansing or displacement. So you see, there will be election, meaning democracy, but before we hold that election,
you need to create a context.
A context, and the context is violent one, because these diverse religious, ethnic, or whatever you call sect. By the way, sect is not a term which is internal to Islamic history. We do have Shia and Sunni, but Islamic history doesn't see it in terms of a conflict between sect, because sect is essentially a Christian term. You cannot think about the term sect unless you think about church. Okay, because it is from there that you defect or you. So the reference point is the church. Now, since the history of Islam is, or in theology of Islam, there is nothing called church, so we cannot have the term sect. But whatever we call it, as firqa or taif, I think in Arabic, right? So now the American conception of democracy in Iraq post-invasion is this, that we will have election, but we will have a right kind of demographic makeup, right? Now, you compare this, because what America was doing post-invasion in Iraq, this is also the history of Israel itself. Because so let's think about in global terms. There are three slogans. One is India, the world's largest democracy. America, the oldest democracy. And Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East. Right? So if you dissect these three slogans and see what is behind the scene, okay, in terms of the slogan of democracy. We know in America, and this is not long ago, President Roosevelt, he said that extermination of Indians was as much desirable as necessary. So what you have a notion of democracy only when you have gotten rid of certain kind of people. So it is not people in general. Democracy is rule of the people, but then you already identified that people with a certain characteristic. It is ethnic, it is religious, it is racial. Now, the same operation you see in the creation of Israel. Okay? I mean, and by the way, many people think that, Israel as a state or the support for Israel became a reality in the wake of Holocaust. Of course, it is true, but we have to also see that there is already something called Christian Zionism, which precedes the Balfour Declaration.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so it is not a direct sort of outcome. I mean, you already have backing of this.
There's the building blocks for what then preceded.
Right. Now, so from the oldest democracy, you see Roosevelt, a particular kind of notion of what demo is, and then in the case of Israel, the mass expulsion. Now, what is important, even some of the scholars who are critics of, and I really value their work of Zionism. Now, I don't know the exact number, but there is a huge number of Palestinians who are in diaspora.
Yes,
right?
Of course.
Now, by international law, they have a right to return. And if they return, and if there is something called one state, then there is a fear on the part of those who are proponent of so-called the only democracy in the Middle East, that you will become a minority, right? Now, if you really go by the logic of rule of the demo, then by international law, these people have a right to return. And if there is something like one state with equal laws, then the Jews would no longer be in a majority. And therefore, you do not want to visualize this situation. You block it. Now, the same thing is happening in India. Because the original idea, of Indian democracy. So you see, this was already laid out, what is known in English as between interwar period, between World War I and World War II. So the Hindu intellectuals, they discussed at length that what is this democracy? Is it good for us or not? Now, at that time, there was also the notion of secularism. So these Hindu intellectuals came to the conclusion that secularism is not good for us. By the way, there is a distinct meaning of secularism in India, which means that people from different faiths, meaning non-Hindus, would also have a share in power. And you will not impose Hinduism upon them. So a place for diversity. So these Hindu intellectuals, they came to the conclusion that no, secularism is not good for us, but democracy is good for us. And they were not, by the way, hiding it. They said that no, this is the way to establish Hindu domination, right? So the appeal for democracy in the world's largest, or in the world's so-called largest democracy, is based on idea that, look, democracy is a method or a procedure which will allow us Hindus to establish domination. This kind of ethnic idea of democracy, right? You see operating in the case of India, in Israel, okay? And it is not about fairness, because democracy is not simply holding election every 5 years or 4 years or whatever. Some countries have only 3 years, right? Democracy is about creating a just and fair society, right? Election is probably one of the means. And I want to finally link it to one of the things which is going to be, in my view, I'm not a futurist, so I cannot predict, but it looks like probably in the future, what you see is, it is already happening, this idea of the great replacement theory. Okay? So now, you know, the idea was already there in Anders Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist. And then it was manifest in this terrorist who killed 56 or some similar number of people in New Zealand.
In New Zealand, yes.
Right? So what is the idea that, look, the European democracy can be sustained only when you have certain kind of people. And then if there are non-white people, okay, if they come to inhabit our land, then democracy is, its future is in jeopardy, right? Now, this idea of democracy, you see...
By the way, just to interject here, because recently we had in the UK the local elections. And one of the aspects of this particular elections and coming up to the parliamentary elections sometime this year was that Muslims, along with many sections of British society who were, as you put it, exhausted from the kind of failures that democracy was bringing them, and Gaza sort of, led to drive that kind of vision, and the results, in a way, exemplified this organization of this, let's just call them a pro-Palestinian campaign, and the articles that then emerged about, the Muslim vote and how it will impact the future of the country, how it will impact the future of societies and the such. When in open democracies, you have interest groups all the time. You have groups that will represent the interests of pensioners. You will have groups that, represent the interests of migrants and so on and so forth. But this was almost intolerable by these so-called liberals working within a democracy and claiming to want the betterment of democracy in the UK.
I mean, in the case of Britain, if you remember, there is a curious paradox.
Yes.
Margaret Thatcher famously said that there's nothing called society.
Nothing called society, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And now they're saying that our society, nowadays you see less of the term called society, it is more civilization, the Western civilization. Now, what is Western civilization? That is also a problematic term, by the way. For most of the non-Western world, you see, Nietzsche was quite a remarkable guy, and he said that if you talk to the tribes in the non-Western world, so what for them Western civilization basically means is narcotics, okay, and violence. So let's leave aside that. So nowadays they're not using, they're using society and civilization at the same time or interchangeably. So once you say that there is no society, meaning that there are only probably individuals or persons, now you are saying that no, the society is under threat. Okay? And what is remarkable, there is a young Dutch activist, I think her first name is Eva. She made recently a speech in Hungary. If you want to use that term, like she's from whatever people like Geert Wilders.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So our civilization.
Far right, extreme.
Far right. Yeah. And also deeply Christian, by the way. They may not be using the term Christian. And this is, by the way, very interesting. If you read this 1400 plus manifesto of Anders Breivik, he says that he is cultural Christian. Okay? Now, of course, it is true that there are many churches which are deserted, or the attendance in churches have gone down, right? So, but this is the religiosity aspect. But of course, more and more people are identifying themselves with Christianity as a culture, as a civilization, as a social code of living, right? So now, and I think this speech, which this young Dutch woman, who is also, I think, by training a lawyer, it had millions of views on Twitter, and even Elon Musk retweeted it, more or less in sympathy. Now, the point is, they are invoking democracy. Of course, Europe is the so-called citadel of democracy. By the way, this is not how Nelson Mandela would think.
Of course.
Because if you read his book, which is called A Long Walk.
A Long Walk to Freedom, yes.
So he says that he learned democracy, not from the West, but from his tribes.
Exactly.
because the decision mechanism. But but in the Western narrative, they are the ones who produced democracy in Greece. Although, as you know, slaves had no
say or no participation in that
right?
democracy.
But now, so in invoking this democracy, they themselves tell you what kind of, or their statement, their strategies, their symbols, their concrete steps tell you day in, day out, that what kind of people they have in mind. It is not people in its diversity, a specific kind of people.
Specific kind of people.
So this woman, Eva, who made this speech, she begins by saying that there was some kind of attack in probably in Britain and then also in Holland on women, Dutch women, and the attacker was immigrant.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so this is how you create this this idea of fear, right? And that is where I think, so back to your first question, if this younger generation, or maybe some also from the older generation, if they are feeling that this idea of national democracy is almost exhausted, okay, then they are probably asking for a reimagining of our political future, okay? So until now, most of us, and I want to tell you this as an Indian citizen, that my country has the saliva-dripping desire to become a permanent member of UN. You know that national security. I, as a student of democracy, I find that this desire is violent. Why? Because the first thing is that joining this, what is this, Security Council as one of
the UN Security Council.
No, the 5 permanent members who have got the veto power.
Yes, China, Russia,
right?
Britain, France, and America.
If you really believe in even elementary sense of democracy, this idea has to be abolished.
Absolutely.
Right?
It defies every notion of democracy.
And as you know, in the case of Israel,
yes,
all these, whenever these resolutions come, probably in most cases, it is America who takes the lead and uses his unprincipled veto right to silence the demand of Palestinians. So as an Indian who believes in national democracy, right, then I would go to the point of saying that, no, my country should immediately become part of this oppressive 5. No, I reject it. Because if you really believe in democracy, rather than having this desire to join
to be part of it,
of that so-called exclusive club, right, which is oppressive, by the way, no, you should be asking for dismantling of it and democratizing the UN structure itself. So it is possible. I cannot say that probably my view would clearly be in a minority. You probably may not have heard an Indian national making this kind of position. But I think there are people, especially the younger generation, and here I think the role of the media is also important. Because the time and space compression. Baudrillard, when the first Gulf War happened, Iraq was bombed. He said that, well, what was the title of the book? He said that the Gulf War that did not happen. So it was a contradictory title. He's saying that Gulf War and then it didn't happen. What he meant is that probably in the human history, that was the first war which was also televised. We saw it on television. Now, compared to 91, we have moved much ahead in terms of the impact that media has, and we are watching it. These wars in in Palestine on our television screen, sitting on the couch, right? So I think given this much change, and it is quite likely that this exhaustion with national democracy will probably, it is already generating the intellectual infrastructure to question this idea of national democracy. Because I sincerely believe that a segment of humanity, I mean, the fact that I don't know if you were born in Iraq.
I was born in Iraq, yes, in 1968.
And I was born in India.
Yes.
But this is not our achievement.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Of course.
So the fact that somebody is born in Argentina or Peru or Chile, right? This is accident.
This is not something to hail them and be sort of feel supreme about.
Proud of,
it's
right?
not an achievement.
Yeah.
I didn't get this by effort or endeavor.
Right. So the point is, our thinking is so much territorially and nationally oriented, right? And the problem with democracy, I mean, what is the international law? The way international politics runs is based on the idea of nation state, right? And what is the most desirable and acceptable form of conducting that politics? That every nation wants to advance its own national interest. Okay? As of now, we do not have any institutional mechanism in which we advance the human interest. Okay? Legally speaking and institutionally speaking. You kill people, and by the way, there is some striking similarity between Israeli form of democracy and the contemporary form of Indian democracy. And that is captured in this violent machine of bulldozers. Okay? And the Indians, the current Indian government seems to be very happy with the Israeli mode of democracy. Some of these ministers have also gone on record to say that, why don't we become like Israel? And why? Because, you see, as we are speaking, probably Rafah is being bombed. And before I came to the studio, I watched a small clip. And this is the use of the bulldozers to demolish the house, to destroy the house. You have similar kind of mechanism in India. All these critics of Modi, but you have the critics of Modi from the so-called left as well, but the houses or some liberals as well. But the bulldozers have been used to destroy the houses mostly of Muslims. And not simply, by the way, houses, but also masajid, madaris, right? Now, I don't understand that if democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East and the largest democracy in the world, is engaged in this sinister, destructive practices, bulldozing houses. And by the way, for poor people, house is not simply a house, it is also a dream, right? So you are dashing their dreams to the ground.
It's everything a family owns.
Exactly. So if this is what democracy has come to be, then I think the younger generation, and also I think there are more people like yourself born in Iraq, you move to different places, right? So this kind of consciousness is, I think, leading us, but we do not have a perfect picture of yet, that no, our struggle has to go beyond this maximization of so-called national interest, right? Because I think one of the major faults of post-World War II thing is to box humanity into nation state, okay? And then each nation state is competing against each other to maximize their respective national interest. I think unless we dismantle this conceptual structure and think beyond the nation state, okay? And this is very necessary, I think, because, if we see in this part of the world, you have Kurdish question, and it involves 3-4 nation state, right? And they're trying to have their own nation state. Probably now in the last 10-15 years, the demand may have changed in terms of autonomy. But still, the major thinking is that no, they have their nation state, we should have our nation state, right?
That's the argument.
Yeah, and that is where I think you see, as a student of sociology or anthropology, but more also in philosophy, while I admire Frantz Fanon greatly, he did wonderful work of writing, but also activism. But one fundamental point that I disagree with him is this, that he wanted to replace bourgeois nationalism with people's nationalism, which is to say that nation remains, and I want to replace its content, bourgeois with people. And I think the further and more humane politics will emerge when we begin to not simply think, but also dismantle conceptually, intellectually, this architecture of nationalism. Because I think this is probably one of the most dehumanizing ideology which has emerged in the world. Far more, and this is on a statistical side, far more number of people have been killed in the last 100 years.
For this cause.
In the name of nationalism.
In the name of nationalism.
Than any other battle. Of course, in the olden times, people used to die in hundreds and thousands of numbers, but these were like plague, for example, for which we didn't have any medicinal cure. But the political violence, right? And people think that, dying for the cause of the nation, right? Which, by the way, is just something which happened yesterday, in the sense that if you look at
history,
long human history, right?
Nothing. What's 100? What's 200? What's 300 years?
And you see, in my class on political anthropology or anthropology of the political, I teach that, look, in history, you had a stateless society. In the beginning of the human history, when there were hunter-gatherers, they didn't have any state.
No borders to stop them, no checkpoints for passports.
So this is so new, right? And on the question of borders and passport, this is very interesting to just note, if only very briefly, that it is only from the late 19th century, maybe we can be even more exact, that from early 20th century, that non-Europeans began to see the European world as a point of destination to migrate. Until that point of time, it is the Europeans and the white people who have been going all over the world. Yeah. And at that time, there was no passport. But once these non-Europeans began to come, okay, then you have the document called passport.
This passport thing, it's quite fascinating and to an extent absurd, that one of the arguments by the pro-Brexit camp, in the case of the United Kingdom and leaving the European Union, was that we feel humiliated, us Brits, because we have to carry a red passport. It's a British passport, but it happens to be of the red color. We need to seize back our blue passport so that we feel. It was an absurd, almost comical argument, but made by people who sit in high offices and who command decisions, who make decisions.
But were they associating red with a particular meaning or something?
Red meaning European, and they wanted blue being the national colors of the UK. It was absurd. The whole notion was absurd. But you're absolutely right. I think that, this is something that we need to expand on. And as you're talking about the absurdity of the argument for nationalism and this kind of classification of people it comes to mind, obviously, the status of the Arab world, where we have 23, countries, all of which share the same language, share the same religions, share the same history, the legacy, culture, food, and the such. And yet, each one of those enclaves is willing to fight with blood and with tears, just in case the other encroaches on their so-called borders. It's a fascinating topic.
There also, I would say that I think, as you know, and you probably know it better than I do, if you compare the Middle Eastern history with the Indian subcontinent, so in the Indian subcontinent, you have organizations which were fighting for national independence. But national independence against whom? The British Empire. When you create a state like Iraq, they were not fighting for independent nation state, and then against whom? No, these are not like fought. These were given, in the sense that it was simply subdivided into different political groupings, simply to disempower people. I mean, you already know this, that when the British announced the creation of Iraq as a nation state, what was the anthem which was played? The Iraqi people, quote unquote, they didn't have any national anthem of their own. So it is the British anthem which is being played right in the ceremony, which announces the creation of Iraq as a separate state. It is "Long live the Queen." So no, Iraq is not fought. It is given, and given because you wanted to dismember the Ottoman Empire.
Ottoman Empire,
right?
Course.
I mean, the case of Egypt is slightly different. Under the Ottoman Empire, these were known as, vilayat.
Yes.
Or
Wilayat. Emirates, for instance.
Emirate, or sometimes you also call Biladu Sham, right? So Sham is a name, but of course it is. And as you know, this treacherous guy called, what was his name?
Sharif Hussein.
Sharif Hussein? I think one of his sons, probably he was first made...
His two sons. One was made king of Iraq, one king of Jordan.
No, but the one who became the king of Iraq...
Yes. Iran. No, Iraq.
Iraq.
Yes. Faisal al-Awwal.
Right. Before that, he was made some kind of governor of Syria.
True. Yes.
Right?
Yes, correct.
So even if you think from within the nationalist paradigm, right? So if he is Syrian...
Yeah. And by the way, they both came from Hijaz.
Of course. Right?
So that makes it even more...
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if Syria is a nation, going by the British or the Western parameters itself, on their own logic, this guy who became governor of Syria, then how can he become the governor of...
King of Iraq.
King of Iraq,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So it is very clear that no, the Western power was not interested in giving freedom or independence. They simply wanted to disempower, to disintegrate, But one of the major things which I realized, I did study Arabic when I was as a child in India. And I used to know Arabic, but it was mostly Fosha. And we used to memorize.
Yes.
Zahaba yazhabu to go, right? Sama yasma'u to listen,
Correct.
But to the extent that I know Arabic, I can understand, but more through interaction, and which has increased more after I moved to Istanbul. Because at Ibn Khaldun University, you have diverse students, Syrians, Yemeni, Iraqi, Egyptian. I think, and this is on the positive side, even though the state or the local elite in the Middle East, they have been groomed or schooled to think in nation-state terms, but it is heartening to see that people on the ground, the common people, they have not fully allowed themselves to be seduced by this ideology of nationalism, right? Now, from a Western perspective, if an Iraqi person has sympathy for what is happening in Gaza, then the only way you can explain this is through transnational radicalism, right? This is the most dominant security-driven framework. No, this is not transnational radicalism. It is, in my view, one of the most fundamental way in which actually you express your humanity. Because at this moment, if there is any humanity left in you, me, or anyone else, this humanity finds its expression in the fundamental ways in which we see suffering unfold in front of our own eyes, these babies being brutally killed. People have been forced to eat grass, and yet, and to see this in terms of like, oh, it is happening there. No, this is not happening there. If you cannot relate it, if you cannot relate your own sense of being who you are as a human to what is unfolding in a very cruel and merciless way in Gaza and elsewhere, then I think you need to ask yourself, or all of us, we need to ask ourselves to what extent we are human in the first place.
Exactly.
Right?
It's the humanity that needs to be questioned.
And that humanity should be I think the building block or the starting point to think afresh about the kind of political order that we want in future.
Thank you so much, Professor Irfan. It's been a pleasure. Jazakallah khair. I learned so much.